皆さんは、こんにちは。僕の名前はジョーシュアです。おじいさんとおばあさん、長野に住んでいます。じゃあ、少し日本語を話せます。でも、まだ上手じゃありません。Hola, me llamo Joshua y creo que puedo hablar español más o menos bien, pero creo que mi español es mejor que mi japonés. So, my name is Josh, and I grew up speaking Spanish, English, and a little Japanese. And I was exposed to a little bit of some other languages here and there, like Polish, a little bit of Yiddish, and some Hebrew. So, to take it all a step back, I was born in Guatemala, and I was adopted at 6 months old. Now, when I say mom and dad, I refer to my adoptive parents. My biological parents I have never met, not since I was born, and so I only know my mom and dad as just that, mom and dad. So I just wanted to get that out of the way because sometimes when people are talking to other adopted children, or maybe not children in this case, but when you're talking to other adopted people, sometimes people say on accident, who are your real parents? Or no, I'm talking about your real parents. And I just want to say that I think for a lot of adopted people, we call our parents the one that we have grown up with most of our lives, mom and dad. There are some cases where if you're adopted a little later on, you might not. But again, completely other story. I just wanted to get that out of the way. So I grew up speaking Spanish because I had a babysitter who spoke Spanish to me. She was from Mexico. So I grew up speaking Spanish, similar Spanish, to pretty much next door. Guatemala and Mexico are linguistically, they're very similar. They're Spanish. There's some colloquial dialects, obviously, but some phrases and slang. But for the most part, they're very linguistically the same. They have the same type of accent. They are very... I know some people disagree with me, but for the most part, if you're talking about Guatemalan Spanish and Mexican Spanish versus Argentinian Spanish or Castilian Spanish, you'll say, yes, they're closer. Right? So I was able to speak Spanish that was originally spoken in Central America. That's kind of where my quote homeland is, and I grew up speaking Japanese because my mother's family, her family is all from Japan, and so in my introduction, I said that my grandma and grandfather, or my grandfather and grandma, oji-san to oba-san, they live in Nagano, which is a prefecture in Japan. And so when I was little, I understand a little bit of Japanese. I'd hear it spoken between my mother and my grandparents. On my father's side, his family, they were from Poland, and he grew up in Sunnyside, Queens. His parents came in after the war as Polish immigrants. They spoke Polish to him as a kid. He didn't really learn the language so well, as he always puts it, but he did, he knows a few phrases and knows how to kind of, get in trouble with the language. And so I grew up, when I would go to my grandmother's house, on my father's side, I would hear some Polish in the house. She'd pick up the phone, get a friend calling her, and then, she'd be like, tak, jak się masz, stuff like that. So, which is like, yes, hello, how are you, whatever. And so I'd hear some Polish thrown around here and there, and so I knew a little bit about what it sounded like, and I could kind of distinguish Polish from Russian, and from other, Eastern languages. And when I was obviously in school, I learned English, and with my friends I spoke English. And I also grew up speaking, or not speaking, but understanding or being exposed to a little bit of Hebrew and Yiddish. So my mother converted to Judaism, and I used to go to Hebrew school, and my mother actually studied biblical Hebrew, and so I grew up, listening to prayers in Hebrew. I grew up to hearing some Yiddish. She used to sing to me some songs in Yiddish, and I was exposed a little bit to the language at a very young age. Same with Hebrew. I believe Russian too. My mother, she used to sing to me in various languages, so I kind of, at a very early age, got very familiar with the sounds of different languages. And basically, I think that's where my whole love for languages has come from, because I was very little when I I was exposed to all these languages. And my mother, she was, I guess you could say, a polyglot in terms that she spoke English, Japanese, Spanish, German, Hungarian, and I think she dabbled with Korean. I'm not entirely sure. But anyway, it was like a handful of languages. And, I was growing up in that environment. My father, he studied French in high school. In my opinion, I think he speaks it okay, reasonably well. I don't know. He kind of sometimes talks about how he barely knows it, but I think he speaks it all right. And he spoke some Polish as well. So linguistically, at the household, we were very diverse. English was our first language at the home. But I'd hear my grandmother every now and then talking to him in Polish. I remember hearing, like I said, a couple phrases being said here and there in Polish at her house. And now with on my mother's side. So I referred to my mother's parents as Gigi and Baba. It's shorthand for Oji-san and Oba-san, which is grandfather and grandma. So it's like, how a child would say grandpa and grandma. So it's like that. And so I've been to Japan a couple times. I went on my own about 6 months ago, and I studied Japanese before that. I spoke with them in Japanese for the most part. My Japanese is pretty rusty and it's not really that great, but I was able to kind of communicate some ideas to them, be able to help out doing a couple of basic chores, and just kind of getting a feel for the language and getting my ideas across. And that brings me to my big point, and I'm going to get to that in a little bit, but it's about, you don't really have to be, quote, fluent in a language, I think, to be multicultural or be bilingual or however you want to put it. I think you should strive, if you want to be bilingual, to learn the language as much as possible, but I don't think it's a requirement. And I'll get to kind of that reason why. Because it's something that I've thought about for a while. And so, essentially, when I was growing up, I grew up in various customs. I grew up with Jewish food. My mother, I was fortunate enough where my mother was able to cook so many different meals and cuisines. So we had Mexican cuisine some nights. Also from my babysitter, I was exposed a lot to Spanish because of her and Mexican culture. Not like to the point where I know a bunch of stuff about Mexican culture, but she taught me about Cinco de Mayo. I almost have seen her as like a second mother or a grandmother, because she was so involved in my life from when I was a little kid to I think I was like 10 or even 11. She was like in the house, and even after that she was working as a cleaning lady. So I was fortunate enough to hear Spanish around the house for some time afterwards. And she saw me grow up, and she taught me a bunch of stuff about, Mexican culture, Mexican cuisine. She spoke to me only in Spanish. And so my Spanish was never great. Like, I know grammatically a lot of what I said was very incoherent, but it was passable, and I could get in trouble with it. And as I got older, I studied the language more. I think it was in 8th grade, I was like, okay, I'm going to learn the language. I want to be fluent in the language. And I studied it. I studied the grammar. I studied everything from vocab to language to the grammar, and then even to the accent marks. When I was in high school, I took Spanish 3, which is like intermediate Spanish, I guess you could say. I skipped Spanish 1, which is like the beginner, because I placed out of it since I had some familiarity with the language. And so I learned how to read and write in Spanish, and listen. I listen to the news every now and then in Spanish, and I can understand a fair amount in it. Speaking, I haven't had much practice, so it takes me a few seconds, and I'm sure my accent in the beginning of the video was kind of like weird, because I didn't grow up speaking Spanish all day with my parents. It was just with my babysitter, and then it kind of stopped. So when I was younger, I probably had more of an accent. But now it's kind of more just English, because that's what I use every day, And I think developing me as a character, I think it's had a lot to do with my character and who I am. I think if you ask any of my friends, they'll be like, yeah, Josh, he's crazy, and he's so many weird different habits and customs. Because, for example, in in Asian culture, I think more specifically in Japan, when you drink or eat noodles, you're supposed to make the slurping sound. That's like a sign that you enjoy the food. And in the US, that's obnoxious for a lot of people. So I do that sometimes when I'm with friends, and then they're like, Josh, stop doing that. That's disgusting, you know? Or I can relate with a fair amount of other people, and this is why I think it's awesome to be, even if I'm not bilingual to the point where I'm able to talk about anything in Japanese or Spanish, you know, I can relate with a lot of different people because I grew up where on my mother's side is Japanese customs and cultures. We, have the New Year's. I should know the name of it, but it's the box of like the layered food and stuff, the stacks that you have. I have Japanese candies and treats like over in that drawer over there. I grew up eating soba noodles, udon, gyoza, and other Japanese cuisines. I also grew up eating Polish cuisine as well. Kielbasa. My grandmother occasionally would make me soups. I don't really recall many times eating it. She used to just make me hot dogs. But, I had some Polish cuisines and some of that stuff. Jewish food, a lot of Jewish cuisine. In fact, today is Passover. And, I have charoset, which I'm going to open up and eat with a little bit of matzah and stuff like that. So it gave me a really nice perspective on the world, being able to just see the world differently and being able to relate with all these different cultures. Now, my final point is talking about bilingualism, and do you really need to know the language? I don't think you do. I don't think you need to know the language like an expert or even super well, to be completely honest. I think, you gotta, if you can learn maybe the first 300 to 500 words and know how to just do simple stuff, like as long as you can relate with someone, whether that's knowing directions, knowing apologies, if you can relate to someone and speak to their heart, then you're doing, I think, a great job at being bilingual. And why do I think that's important? In my opinion, I think it's important because it gives you perspective on not just linguistically, like other sounds and stuff, which, don't get me wrong, knowing other words and differentiating between sounds is awesome for the brain. There's been studies on it too. It's got tons of benefits. But as a person and as your character development, you can kind of understand why someone might act the way they do. Why do some people in some cultures sit on the floor when they eat? It's because their culture reflects this thought in their culture, and it allows you to understand that kind of mindset, and that you're not the center of the world. It's like it helps you, I think, get a wider perspective on the world. And so that's why I think growing up bilingual, if you can, especially if you're younger, because when I started learning languages I was about 13 or 14, and now I'm 18 years old, and I noticed it's actually a little bit harder to stick with learning a language because, I didn't want to ever use this as an excuse, but I do notice that as I have more work to do, it's harder to dedicate more time to languages. And it just doesn't stick as much. But that being said, you got to work a little bit harder, man, If you're younger than 18, you learn a language. It's not so hard. It's something you can commit 20, 30 days to, even once every 3 days. Just know a few words. It helps you, again, build that brain exercise the brain, and helps develop that perspective. So that's why I think it's important. So with that being said, I hope you guys enjoy this little interview of myself, and I wanted to share my experience learning languages to kind of give you a real overall picture as to why I'm even doing this project in the first place. It's because I love languages, and I love sharing that message that we should, be more connected as a species, and be willing to learn another person's culture and language. So with that being said, take care. Or in Japanese, ja mata ne, adios.